This is Andy Aldrin. Um, I am Director of Space Programs at Embry-Riddle University. I've been a space cadet for my entire life. I mean, literally since I was 6 years old. Um, you all enlisted in space, so to speak. You all chose to be part of space. I got drafted when I was 6 years old. My dad was training to do a spacewalk, and he pioneered underwater training. So he had been scuba diving, but he started scuba diving a lot more. And so I was going to be his dive buddy. At 6 years old, he strapped a tank onto me, and I was his dive buddy as he was thinking about spacewalks. And for the next 60 years, we talked about space. Mostly I listened because my dad talks a lot and doesn't listen all that well. But yeah, for 60 years, I've been a space cadet in one way, shape, or form, growing up with my dad, working in research institutes, working in industry. And for about the last 10 years, I'm a space educator. And it's been the most rewarding part of my life. And the thing about being an educator is it forces you to think about stuff. And I think about a lot of different things in space. And so we're going to talk about some of that stuff. The thing about Apollo was it was probably the largest space startup in history because when these guys started, they were 26, 27 years old. They were just walking into an organization that didn't have any boundaries. They had a clear goal. It was an audacious goal, and they did whatever they could to make things happen. And so, one of the most incredible stories about the moon to me is so the original architecture actually looked eerily like SpaceX's architecture to go to the moon right now. Von Braun had massive rockets that were going to send massive rockets to the moon, and it wasn't going to work. And there was a guy named John Houbolt who wasn't really that senior of a guy at Langley Research Center in Virginia. It wasn't even like it used to be sort of really important research center back in the 20s and 30s. Wasn't all that important. So this guy wasn't a big dog engineer. He just had an idea. And his idea was instead of sending a big rocket to the moon, what you do is actually send little stuff and something small that goes to the moon and comes back, and you actually rendezvous in lunar orbit instead of rendezvousing in Earth orbit. And that changed everything. And so he went to von Braun. Von Braun was literally a god of space. And he went to him, pitched this idea, and von Braun initially didn't really like it, but he came around pretty quickly. And that's an astonishing achievement to have decisions coming up from the very bottom up to the top and it happening. That's the startup mentality. And that's what all of you are kind of growing up in. The other great entrepreneurship story I have is uh, I started my career as a Sovietologist. I studied the Soviet Union, but I was still pretty much a space cadet. So one of the passions I had was how did the Soviet Union beat the United States into space? And it was a process of entrepreneurship. You had guys at the bottom, guys, there weren't too many women involved in this in Russia at the time, who before World War II were dreaming of going into space. And then World War II came, and a lot of these people got thrown, in fact, Korolev got thrown into prisons in Siberia and spent a lot of time in Siberia, a lot of the war in Siberia, because Stalin thought they were enemies of the people because they were smart. And they still believed in space. And after the war, they got out and they got to Germany and they started looking at what the Germans had done. And they said, this stuff is incredible. Stalin, the Soviet leadership didn't really care about V2s and German rockets, but these guys did. And they brought it back to Russia and nobody would take it. They didn't want to have anything to do with spacecraft. They wanted long range bombers and all that. But these guys managed to work together. They were sitting in 6 different ministries and they created a space program that the leadership didn't want. And they sold it. And then all of a sudden, when they launched Sputnik, it was a great moment that they called up Sergei Khrushchev, the premier at the time. And they said, we launched something into space. Isn't that great? Khrushchev said, it's really late at night. You guys are great. See you later. Bye. And then, of course, the rest of the world went nuts. And from that point on, but they built a program from the bottom up. They were true entrepreneurs. Sergei Korolev was the world's first, and I'll say still the greatest space entrepreneur ever. And um, and so I mean there are great stories from the history of space entrepreneurship. You aren't the first ones to do this, but you all of you are the luckiest people and the luckiest space cadets in the world ever. Because you're going to have the opportunity to do stuff that couldn't be done. You're all going to have the opportunity at some point in your career, I think, to apply for jobs on the moon, right? You all know that you're going to have the opportunity to fly in space. We've literally got kids in high schools building satellites. Think about that, building satellites today. And so this is the most exciting time in space ever. And you should be thankful just how fortunate you are. You should be excited too, because you all got great careers ahead of you. And I'm really, really, I'm excited for all of you. First of all, it's a great time to be in space. But not all space is great. There are parts of space that are really great. There are parts of space that aren't so great. We don't need to get in that much to some of the parts that I'm not. I am not a huge fan of launch. Launch is a really tough business. But I'll tell you what I am a fan of is geospatial. When I mean geospatial, I think about the big business that you're in, right? If you're in satellite communications, you're in SATCOM, but you're really in telecommunications, right? Because you're competing with fiber, you're competing with cellular and all that, and it's a tough competition. And satellites will lose that competition, which is one of the reasons I'm not in love with that. Why I am in love with space-based observation, space-based geospatial data is you can do things in space that you simply can't do anywhere else, and they must be done. Space will never get taken over by something else. You can't have enough drones around to do the things you need to do in space. So the data is all going to come from space. But that industry is going to change dramatically. It's going to change from, right now we've got a company that builds satellites and they're building their satellites and they're processing the data and then they're selling the data and they're selling just their data, whether it's hyperspectral, which is wonderful data, RF data, um, panchromatic, whatever. Um, and they're just selling their single data stream. But we've got, last count, I think I had 70 different companies that are building EO platforms, selling basically any kind of data, but they're all selling it separately to their customers. And their customers are like farmers in the Amazon. And it's literally like some astronaut is descending from Silicon Valley with an iPad trying to sell somebody a farmer data, and the farmer looks like, dude, you just came from Mars as far as I'm concerned. And so that's going to change. That business is going to resegment. And I think the biggest driver of that change is probably going to be machine language, because what's going to happen is you've got all of these different sensors, different places, different times, different resolutions dumping data into a data processor using artificial intelligence or whatever we're going to be calling it next year to process that data and do incredible things with it. But the amazing part of it is going to be the person on the ground that understands what the customer really needs and understands what the satellite can produce and understands what you can do with artificial intelligence to generate incredibly powerful products. But that segmentation is going to happen, and it's going to create incredible opportunities for all of you, particularly in the area of data processing, artificial intelligence, all that kind of stuff. And so that's where I get super excited. I mean, I think that's like it's a $50 billion a year industry for the commercial side of it. The government side of it will continue to be. I mean, we spend something between 50 and 70 billion dollars on geospatial in the government, and it's national security. So don't forget that. That is the big, 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 big dog in that industry. But I think the commercial side of it is going to be driving the technology more than anything. I don't think the National Reconnaissance Office will ever be dependent upon commercial sources for their most strategic data, the stuff that they really use to blow up things. That I don't think they'll ever get comfortable with that. But I think and that's not to say working in the national security community isn't a horrible thing. I mean, I like the Space Force. It's a really exciting organization, but it is the military. And the military, I just spent 2 days in a workshop with military educators, and they're more concerned, frankly, about, figuring out their own organization. But I think there are exciting technical things happening in that industry. I'm obviously an old guy. Some of my students call me the cosmic curmudgeon. I don't really know a whole lot about AI. You guys know about AI, but I do think about where the great applications are. And I already mentioned geospatial. I think that's easy. We know that's going to be great. One of the things that I think has potential and really kind of interesting potential for reshaping the industry is AI and engineering. And the way I think about it is, I teach a course in space systems management. It's actually, we do launch systems, a bunch of different things, but in doing that, we use a lot of cost models because cost is obviously something which is very important, and you have to use parametric models. And so when you look at cost and what drives cost for development of systems, there are two things that are important. One thing is the maturity of your design. So if you've got a design that's like generation 5 design, it's going to cost a lot less to do generation 6 than it was to do generation 1 because you've learned a lot. The other thing that's important is the experience of your team. These two things can drive down costs by more than 50%. Now, that is what AI does, right? It takes your level of knowledge from a first system to a fifth system if you've got good data. And it takes the experience level of your team from first year to 10th if you've got data. And so the question is for space companies, where is that data? And the interesting bit, and I say interesting kind of an academic sense, because it's just an interesting question to me, because I'm not working in industry. But for you all, like it may be interesting more in the Chinese sense that, may you live in interesting times. Here's the thing. Startup companies don't have the data, right? Black Sky, Spire, these companies have a track record of 2 or 3, 5, 10 years at the most. But you look at the legacy companies, and so they've been building stuff for decades. They got tons of data. So they can build they're capable, they've got the data to build really good models. Whereas the startups are going to be a little disadvantaged. They don't have that data. And so what's going to happen with that? And I mean, the startups are obviously dynamic and have, I think, much more aggressive innovation. And by the way, most of the innovation is on the managerial side, willingness to take risk. I mean, the major innovation of SpaceX and reusability wasn't reusability. We knew how to do that. We just thought you had to pull apart the whole engine to do it, and they didn't. The first time I went to the first time I only went to one heavy launch where I actually got to see the boosters before they launched. We went into saw them there. The two outboard boosters, they didn't even clean them up. They're full of carbon. The innovation was just to say, let's do it again. Let's see what happens. And that took a lot of guts, but that's the major innovation. And I'm sure that Tom Mueller did lots of incredible things in designing engines that are capable of that. But you remember the RD-180 was supposed to be good for reusable. Nobody ever had the guts to launch it again. So that's the innovation. But I think what's going to happen, getting back to startup companies who have this innovative mindset, but they don't have the data. Now, you could see some really interesting industry reorganizations because there are legacy companies that I could see getting out of the space business, particularly if a startup comes in and goes, you know what, we'll give you $100 billion for your database. I won't mention any companies, but as a shareholder in one of those companies, I'd have to look at it and go, I can take that deal. And then you may see that kind of really interesting industry reorganization in ways you never thought about AI driving the market. Yeah, so I think it's going to, aside from everything else, I just think you're going to see industry move in so many directions you hadn't even thought about. And a lot of the stuff you think about probably isn't going to happen. I've got two pieces of advice for you. I'm old enough that I ought to have more, but I'm going to make it two. The first is follow your passion. If you see something that's cool that you want to do, particularly, I mean, you all have got the career space to do it. Go do something that's cool that you're passionate about. Because I mean, space is a great place, but and don't be afraid to move around. That's the first piece. Second piece of advice is it it's the questions that are important, and ask hard questions, and don't settle for rubbish as an answer. I mean, question everything. It is a good thing because particularly as you're growing up in an AI world, I believe firmly that it's artificial stupidity if you ask it the wrong question. It's not intelligence. And you will always be the source of intelligence for artificial intelligence. And don't forget that. The important thing is you got to know the right questions. And I think AI is going to liberate you all to do thinking rather than grinding on data or code or whatever. And that's going to be really exciting. So have fun.